Kia ora, welcome to this episode of The Image Austenite. I am Frances Duncan, author, Austenite life coach. My co-host is Emma Dunning.
Hello.
Today we're discussing the very first chapter of Sense Sensibility. In chapter 1, we meet the Dashwoods who live at Norland Park. Mr. Henry Dashwood dies, leaving a wife and 3 daughters. His son from a previous marriage and his wife take over Norland after promising to look after the others, which is a lie. All the females are emotional, but the eldest, Eleanor, governs herself.
Let's talk about the title.
Sense and Sensibility.
In its first draft, it was called Eleanor and Marianne.
Family tradition tells us this. Yes, it was written in letters. Do we believe that this was actually the case?
What is your opinion?
Everything that we supposedly know, we only really know through family tradition. We do not have documented evidence from Austen herself, and therefore we can never actually say whether that was the case or not.
So there is no manuscript first draft evidence with Eleanor and Marianne written on the top.
That is correct. We do not currently have that evidence. It'd be great if we did, but I feel like Austen probably destroyed it because she no longer needed it if such a thing existed. That's not to say that we can't just carry on the conversations if it did.
If it were true, it would tell us something about what the book's about.
And do you think that the Sense and Sensibility is a simple swap from Marianne and Eleanor, or Eleanor and Marianne? No, I forget which way it went.
Well, the way it goes also matters. I don't think it's a direct swap. I believe that it has been thought to be a direct swap. So if it's called Eleanor and Marianne, Eleanor is the most important person. Often people are more interested in Marianne than they are in Eleanor.
She is the more traditional heroine.
Often people will assign the sense to Eleanor and the sensibility to Marianne. A modern audience will get a little bit confused about what sensibility means because is Marianne sensible?
You've got a definition of sensibility for us?
Of course I have. I pulled out my dictionary. I looked up the etymology.
Ooh!
So both of them come from Latin. They come from sentire, to feel. Sense, the most relevant meaning of the word sense, is moral discernment or understanding, or sound practical judgment or intelligence.
That does sound like Eleanor. What about sensibility?
So sensibility, there are quite a number of relevant meanings. They're ordered in the frequency that they're used. Number 2 meaning is the capacity for responding to emotion or an impression. Number 3 is the capacity for responding to aesthetic stimuli, i.e. music. Number 4 is mental responsiveness, discernment or awareness. Number 5 is emotional or moral feelings.
I feel like the first 2 sound like what we understand of Marianne, perhaps.
They do. And the second 2 actually sound quite like Eleanor.
One of the crucial things about Eleanor, which I think we even cover in this chapter, she had an excellent heart, her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. And that's the real difference. Eleanor still feels potentially to the same level as Marianne, but she's able to govern her reactions.
The definition of the word sensible.
Ooh!
Number 1, having or showing good sense or judgment. So it's the judgment that governing your feelings. And having the capacity for sensation or sensitive, as in I am sensible of your feelings.
Which is a use that we don't make of that word these days.
The first definition is number 1, showing good sense or judgment, and having the capacity for sensation is definition number 3. So very uncommon to use sensible to mean that.
That word with those dual meanings of feeling and the capacity to feel feeling could also be the title for this novel and cover both sisters with the word sensible.
Here's my clincher. Here's a description of Marianne. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. It mentions also the excess of her sensibility. So she is both sensible and she has sensibility. And then when Jane Austen's describing Margaret, she says that Margaret doesn't have Marianne's sense.
Ooh.
So sense, sensible, and sensibility are all used for Marianne.
Are you making a argument that the actual main character is Marianne, perhaps?
I'm not. I'm going to make the argument, and we've got a whole novel to decide if I'm on the right track. It's not that Eleanor is sense and Marianne is sensibility. Both characters have sense and both characters have sensibility. It's about the balance of those in each of them. At the start, Eleanor has a lot of sense, meaning intelligence and good judgment, and less sensibility, the responsiveness and emotion to her sister's feelings, and that her sensibility rises over the course of the novel. At the beginning, Marianne has a great deal of sensibility in some sense, and that her sense rises. But that's not absolute because of the crossover of the meanings. So, for example, Eleanor has a lot of moral feeling and Marianne has a lot of emotional feeling, and both of those things are sensibility. So maybe it's just a musing on the nature of sense and the nature of sensibility. Or maybe her publisher just made her do it.
We do not know. There's not any evidence saying that her publisher did make her change the title. I think it does complicate things a lot that word usage has moved so much in the 200 years since.
Yeah.
That sensibility is not a word that's ever used.
Sometimes people talk about an artistic sensibility.
That's true. I apologise, you are correct. But that has a different meaning to how we would use it here. Or is it like you're saying that you're able to have reactions to art, and that's the sensibility, yes. And that's what they're talking about when they say an artistic sensibility?
Yes.
I thought artistic sensibility was more like they were an arty person.
Yes, I think they do, and I think that Marianne does have that. There's a concert at one point at which Eleanor's attention is wandering because she doesn't have an artistic sensibility, and Marianne's always caught by music, and her mind wanders off away from conversation towards music whenever music's around.
We know that music's very important to her, so much so that despite the little money that the family has when they move away from Neuland, spoiler, they take a piano with them of Marianne's. That would have been a big expense.
Speaking of expense, let's go back to chapter 1. Very specific about money, this chapter. We start situating the family in place, Sussex, and exactly where they fit in society, their house and their money.
It says they've been there for many generations, so you know that they're very definitely landed gentry. They're not upstarts, people who've made their money through trade, at least in recent generations. The estate is worth £4,000 a year. It seems weird, at least to me, to start with this historical stuff, because we're not even starting with Eleanor and Marianne, which of them we may decide is the main character. We're talking about the history of the family and generations of the family. Then they talk about the late owner. His sister died 10 years ago, and then the Dashwoods come to live with him. And that introduces those characters, but they're only described as the children. They're not even named till the end of the chapter.
So it would be an unusual way to start a novel now.
But potentially not then.
Not then. What this reminds me of is a mihi, where you situate your characters in their family so that people get an understanding of how they might relate to the characters. Are there any connections? Is there anything we have in common before you meet the characters?
And Austen finds a different way of doing this later in Persuasion when she has Sir Walter literally reading out of the baronetage. Yeah. So you're getting this information in a different way and you're learning more about Sir Walter. For people in this period, understanding people's lineage was important to know whether they were landed gentry, whether they deserved a certain level of respect or not, because what rank of society they were on meant that you might treat them differently. And this is something that comes up a lot in this novel. Austen plays with that between people that have money and not rank, and people that might have rank but are maybe not great people, who deserve certain levels of respect and treatment depending on their behaviour, I'd say, is what Austen wants us to think about, rather than the amount of money that they have or their rank in society.
You know, in meditation, they talk about the beginner's mind, forgetting what you know. Frances and I have read this book
many times.
A number of times. The people who were reading this book back in 1811, this was an unknown author, not previously published. They're picking this book up. What they know about it is the title. Was it by a lady, the first?
Yes,
yeah.
Till after she died that anything had her name on it.
The very first page where they decide whether they're going to continue reading the book is this background. So I guess she's in part kind of identifying, are you the right person to be reading this book? She's establishing her credentials.
Maybe it's the other way around. Are these people worthy of your attention? You're setting it up so that you know that they're a family of quote-unquote worth, therefore you'll be interested in their story.
Yes, because I guess the only people who can afford books are going to be of a certain class.
But then very quickly, following this chapter, Austen turns it on its head, because then we follow the members of the family who have to leave the estate and don't have a lot to live on.
Hold that jumping ahead, because once we've established this, it doesn't go on for too long, don't worry. Folk who haven't read it before, you won't have to read very far before we launch straight into shocking drama. There's a funeral and appalling behaviour occurs, and we have some very vigorous language. No sooner was his father's funeral over than Mrs. John Dashwood, without sending any notice of her intention to her mother-in-law, arrived with her child and their attendants.
She's just turned up and going, cool, my house. What are you going to do about it?
All sorts of violent language.
Tell me about the violent language.
Violent language. Disgust and despising in between the former lady of the house, Mrs. Henry Dashwood, who has been living there with her 3 daughters and whose husband has just died, and her daughter-in-law, Mrs. John Dashwood, who's arriving to take over the house. And there are some very strong words in the description of the Dashwood daughters, the language that's attached to Marianne: excess, violence, affliction. And the words that are attached to Eleanor are struggle, exert, proper attention, forbearance.
Those play out through the whole novel.
They do. Keep watching the whole way through the novel. What words are attached to which character? The vocabulary tells you so much about character in this novel. Mrs.
Dashwood is described in parallel with Marianne, that they have similar ways of emoting, that they...
This is Mrs. Henry Dashwood.
Mrs. Henry Dashwood, the widow.
Marianne's mother.
She despised her daughter-in-law for the behaviour and basically wants to run away immediately. How dare she be treated this way? Marianne's sensibility is valued and cherished by Mrs. Dashwood, and they encourage each other in the violence of their affliction, the agony of grief. They voluntarily renew this and create it over and over, giving themselves up to their sorrow, their wretchedness, and thinking that they will never be consoled. Eleanor, also affected by it, but she exerts herself. She tries to rouse her mother to act as she should to the son and daughter-in-law, but she's leaving it up to Eleanor, who is only 19, to manage. I get that she's a widow, but is it fair for a mother to leave her 19-year-old daughter to have to be the grown-up?
Not in the long term, but I think we have to allow her a little window of grief. She knows that her life is going to change dramatically.
The point that Austen's making, though, is that Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne are indulging in the grief. They're going completely overboard with it.
Yes, absolutely. She's clearly on Eleanor's side for this stiff upper lip approach here.
Very English. Mrs. John Dashwood had never been a favourite of her mother-in-law and sisters, but she does not care. Hence her behaviour basically taking over. Even though, yes, it is her husband's house and it is her right to come to Norland, but the way that she does it is unfeeling and tacky. Had Mr. John Dashwood married somebody different than his current wife, he might have been a better person. But she is described as narrow-minded and selfish. Her influence on him makes him more so.
So this book was a huge success for a first book. There's an indication in the first chapter of why, in my opinion. We've heard Mrs. Dashwood had never been a favourite with any of her husband's family, but she had had no opportunity till the present of showing them with how little attention to the comfort of other people she could act when occasion required it. So that is the kind of observation and wit that have meant that Jane Austen's writing is still popular 200 years later. But these people were seeing it for the first time, and I feel like that kind of writing, that's what's new. That's why Jane Austen was successful.
Because she's actually saying how people are, but in such a way that it's not flat out saying Mrs. John Dashwood is a bitch, but saying, look how little she cares for other people, and she will just act that way because she feels like it.
And she's saying it in a way that is elegant rather than harsh, so that people can agree with it without feeling they've sinned.
Because you wouldn't normally speak badly of other people.
But you can really enjoy someone else doing it.
The question that I had when we were reading this novel as a society was, what do you think this chapter tells us is important to each of the characters?
Frances, I feel from that evil smile that you're showing and that listeners can't see, that perhaps you might like to take that one.
So the former Mr. Dashwood, whose death begins this whole thing, what's important to him is the male line. It does not appear that there is an entail because Mr. Henry Dashwood was the legal inheritor of the Norland estate and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. The legal inheritor meaning this is the male line, so he's the one that should get it. But by saying the person who he intended to bequeath it meant it was still his choice who it went to. And it did go to Mr. Henry Dashwood. However, it's secured in such a way that it will then have to pass down to Mr. John Dashwood, then to Mr. John Dashwood's son. So an entail has been set in place. The text tells us that he's fond of Mr. John Dashwood's son because he's a cute little kid. Austen, I think, shows us a little that she's not that fond of children, talking about his imperfect articulation, an earnest desire of having his own way, many cunning tricks, and a great deal of noise. But I mean, most 4-year-olds are going to be that way. But that has sold the former Mr. Dashwood to such an extent that he's locked down the estate, which means that Mr. Henry Dashwood cannot do much to support his wife and daughters. He cannot sell off any parts of the estate to get money for the girls' dowries. That's what's important to the original Mr. Dashwood. So Mr. Henry Dashwood really cares about family. He's concerned about laying aside money to be able to provide for his widow and daughters. He thinks he'll be able to do this from the large estate, and he also has some money from his former wife. It's just unfortunate that he dies a year after his uncle. Mr. Henry Dashwood asked his son to support his widow and sisters, but Mr. John Dashwood doesn't have the sort of feelings that the rest of his family does. He's talked about being cold-hearted and selfish, and then his wife makes him even worse. He thinks that, sure, I can be generous about the money. It seems like he's actually going to give them the money in this chapter. He thought of it for many days and did not repent, that he promised to his father that he'd give his sisters money.
And he's thinking about £1,000 for each of the sisters, which doubles their dowries.
His wife, we have learned, is selfish and does not really care about other people. Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne care a lot, obviously, about the late Mr. Dashwood. Expressing that emotion is really important to both of them. Whereas to Eleanor, it's more about that word duty again, being there to welcome her brother and sister-in-law. And Margaret, she's just tacked right on the very end. Like, she's really insignificant. She seems to be a bit like Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood potentially, but we don't really know enough about her to know what's important to her at this point in time. But what this sets up for us about what's important to the characters, John is selfish, and he continues to be selfish as the novel continues, not giving the money to his sisters and stepmother, which they will refer to as mother-in-law. Fanny, also selfish, and continues to be so. Mrs. Dashwood doesn't seem to be as emotional throughout the novel, but also we don't focus on her as much as we do Marianne and Eleanor, and the patterns of Marianne being very emotional about things and Eleanor being the sensible one and thinking about duty is the thing that kind of continues.
We need to talk about Marianne's name.
Go.
Some people call her Marianne. Some people call her Marianne. Some people call her Marianne. How would that have been pronounced if you were, for example, Jane Austen?
So those are really, really subtle, and I think you're going to have to say them a lot clearer for people to actually hear the differences.
Here is my Kiwi pronunciation of Marianne, Marianne, and Mary-Anne.
I don't actually know, because also it was hard for my ear to pick up those differences. When it comes to, for example, Maria, we know that that's pronounced Mariah, not how we'd say it now, we'd say Maria, but that sounds really different. But Marianne, the variations on that sound very similar and could be very difficult for us to pick up potentially. Are you going to tell me you know exactly how it was pronounced?
I don't know how it was pronounced.
Ooh.
Watch this space. We'll get back to you on that one.
There's a podcast about The Good Place. When Vicky is pretending to be Michael, she's wearing a Michael suit. They tell the actor Ted Danson that he has to say Eleanor differently from how he normally does because he normally says Eleanor, but Vicky says Eleanor, so he has to say it differently when it's Vicky pretending to be Michael. But if you were just watching the show, you might not pick up that difference in how people say the name.
Well, that brings us to the question about Eleanor.
Okay.
Is she Eleanor or is she Eleanor?
Don't know.
See, I think she's Eleanor.
Ooh.
Because of the spelling. Eleanor, which is Eleanor to me, as opposed to Eleanor, which is the Elinor.
So this is Eleanor, and in Northanger Abbey we have an Eleanor.
Yes.
Ah, that would explain the different spelling.
That's based on zero research.
All of this is based on zero research for me. You've obviously done research though.
Well, I looked up the dictionary. Books are made to have personal responses to. That's what your writer is writing for, a direct relationship with the reader.
If someone is reading a book and it's not making them feel anything, what's the point?
Well, non-fiction.
Non-fiction can still make you feel things.
Of course it can, but it doesn't have to.
Well, technically fiction doesn't have to either. But for people to be engaged, you want to write something that makes people feel, and that's why Austen's using those words, agony and wretchedness and being overpowered.
So if the chapter had continued with the background stuff, this is how much they earn, this person had this child who had this child, I don't know that it would have grasped the reader's attention. It wouldn't have grasped their emotion, but I suspect a 19th century reader probably could tolerate a little more background before they gave up.
Because the style of books is really different.
Yes.
These days they tell you to drop the reader right in the middle. Don't start at the start in the middle. Start where the action is. You can tell the backstory later if it's necessary. It might not even be necessary, but you want to grab people, you want them to be interested. I'm not sure people reading the start of this these days would necessarily go, "Ooh, I need to know more," right at the very start. As you go through the chapter, maybe.
Maybe we need to cut and paste and see with a brand new reader Two different versions.
I think it would be really interesting to start with, no sooner was his father's funeral over than Mrs. John Dashwood, without sending any notice of her intention to her mother-in-law, arrived with her child and their attendants.
That's where the style changes.
That's a big bang. Here's the thing that's happening. Someone's behaving insensitively. Technically not inappropriately. Technically. Doesn't mean she's not a bitch.
However, chapter 1, one way or another, has set us up beautifully for the dreadful behaviour in chapter 2.
Which we're not going to talk about.
That was your cliffhanger, Frances.
I'm just saying, I'm just telling you that we're not talking about chapter 2.
I know we're not,
I'm going to keep all of this in, by the way, because it's funny.
I more or less represent quite a lot of sense and a small amount of sensibility, but wait till next week, folks. You're going to get a lot of sensibility.
And that's our discussion of chapter 1 of Sense and Sensibility. I've been Frances Duncan. This has been Emma Dunning. Thank you for listening. We wish you happy reading.
Not the entomology.
Because that's bugs.
Because that's bugs.